Hello, my name is Spyros Heniadis, and this is where I answer your photography questions and we learn about photography together. Quick note before we jump into the video today, I'm actually reaching out to you guys, my 4,700 subscribers, because I need your help. I'm looking for somebody to edit my videos for me. I do a lot of work every week to put these videos together, and one of the things that I'd like to contract out is the video editing. It would be paid work. We're looking at 3 to 5 hours per week of work editing my videos for me. If you're interested, check out spyrosphoto.com. I've set up a special website for this application process. I'll also have the link down in the description below. I have had a bunch of questions about dynamic range. Now, just like we dove into sharpness when I did 3 different videos on how to get tack sharp photos, we're going to spread this over a few different videos because understanding dynamic range and how it affects us as photographers is really important to photography. So I'm not going to try to cram it all into one video. We're going to be talking about this over the next several videos. Have you ever taken a photograph that looks like this? In this photo, the sky is just about completely overexposed. And when a part of your image is overexposed, what happens is that for that part of the photo, the camera received way too much light. Now, if you remember from when we talked about sensors, the sensor in your camera is actually made up of millions of tiny little individual sensors put together to form one big sensor. When you take a photograph, each one of those individual tiny sensors receives light to record as part of the final photograph that's produced by the camera. But each of those individual sensors in your camera is only capable of holding a certain amount of light before it becomes overwhelmed. You can think of each of these little individual sensors as a little tiny bucket in the camera. If too much light fills up one of these buckets, then that bucket becomes overwhelmed. It's like the bucket is actually overflowing with light because it can't hold it all. And when that happens, the part of the photo being recorded by that individual sensor becomes overexposed. When we say overexposed, it means that the area of the photo that is overexposed contains no texture, no color, or no detail. You can see it in the photograph that we're looking at right here. The entire sky area is overexposed because that part of the sensor just received way too much light, and all of those buckets were overflowing. Now, generally speaking, we do not want this to happen when we're taking a photo because we want color, we want texture, and we want detail in these areas of our photograph. Now, on the opposite end of this spectrum is when individual sensors do not get enough light. And when they don't get enough light, they can also lose color, texture, and detail. And it looks just like this. In this shot, which was taken within seconds of the shot we were just looking at a minute ago, much of the area in the upper right of the photograph is completely underexposed. So instead of getting way too much light like the sky did in the previous photograph, the individual bucket sensors in the upper right area of this photo did not get enough light. And as a result, all of the texture, color, and detail in that area is gone, and we are left with pure black. So because we didn't receive enough light, it is pure black and it is underexposed. The reason this happens, where a part of your photograph is completely overexposed or a part of your photograph is completely underexposed, is because of dynamic range. When you take a photograph, all of the millions of tiny individual sensors in the camera are all receiving different amounts of light at the same time as the picture is being taken. So when you photograph a scene like this, where you have very bright areas and very dark areas, this is what's actually happening. All the little sensor buckets from the bright areas of the scene are filling up and overflowing with light before the sensor buckets from the dark part of the scene can get enough light to register the texture, color, and detail. So by the time the dark area of the photo sends enough light to the camera to record the texture, color, and detail that we want, and in this particular case the darkest area is the upper right of the photo, the brightest area has sent way too much light to the camera. All of those sensor buckets have overflowed because they got way too much light. And as a result, the brightest area, which is the sky, is overexposed, which is what we're seeing right here. Understanding this is important because dynamic range tells us how much light the individual sensor buckets can actually hold. But the way we talk about dynamic range normally doesn't always make this clear. For example, cameras are given a dynamic range of a certain number of stops. And if you remember from my previous videos, a stop is how we measure light in photography. And when you change the light by 1 stop, you either double the light or cut it in half. So most modern cameras have a dynamic range of 10 to 12 stops. As an example, my Canon 60D has a dynamic range of 11.5 stops. And this is the part that isn't always clear, because when they tell you a camera has a dynamic range of 11.5 stops, what they're not telling you is that number actually is a ratio. So instead of saying my Canon 60D has a dynamic range of 11.5 stops, it would be more accurate to say that my Canon 60D has a dynamic range of 11.5 to 1. This ratio tells us how bright the brightest part of an image can be compared to how dark the darkest thing in the image is, while still maintaining color, texture, and detail in the photograph that you are trying to take. That is dynamic range. And I'm going to say this again because that's a bit of a mouthful, and then I'm actually going to explain it so that you can understand it a little bit better. Dynamic range is the difference between the darkest area in the photo and the brightest area of the photo that your camera is able to record and still have color, texture, and detail in both the bright and dark area of that photograph. The key part of that definition is the bit about maintaining color, texture, and detail. Practically speaking, what this means is that when you're taking a photograph that looks like this, I want some level of color and detail in the darkest area of the photo, which is the upper right, and I want color and detail in the brightest area of the photo, which is the sky, then the sky cannot be more than 11.5 stops brighter than this dark area in the upper right. If the sky here is 12, 13, 15, 20 stops brighter than the darkest area, then we're going to get a photograph that looks just like this. The sky is simply too bright. It exceeds the dynamic range of the camera. So what does all of this mean? Well, in a nutshell, dynamic range is simply a comparison of the brightest and the darkest light. For our cameras, that comparison of the brightest and darkest light is the maximum capability of the camera to record detail in the bright and the dark areas at the same time. If you exceed the dynamic range of the camera, then a part of your photograph is either going to be overexposed or underexposed. And when you're looking at the actual scene that you are photographing, the dynamic range is the comparison of the darkest thing in that scene compared to the brightest thing in that scene that you're actually going to be photographing. So that is what dynamic range is, and understanding what it is as it relates to photography is the important first step, because it tells us that our camera has a limitation, and if we understand that limitation, we can use that information to make decisions when we're taking a photograph so that we can avoid taking photos that look like these right here. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. Now, if you have any questions about dynamic range, you can leave them in the comments down below. The very best way to get a hold of me for questions is to head over to selfhelpphotographer.com, join my mailing list, and send me an email. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and you guys know what the most important thing to do is. Get out there, take some damn photos. I'll see you guys next week. That's the happy I got heat in my studio dance.